It began with a sound unlike anything American soldiers had heard before. A deep, angry whump, followed by a metallic shriek that seemed to tear the air itself apart. On the test ranges of Aberdeen in 1941, the first American-built 40mm Bofors gun spat flame into the cold morning, and every man watching it felt the same instinctive reaction: a step backward, a blink of shock, and then a slow grin spreading across their faces. This was no ordinary anti-aircraft gun. This was something alive. The original Bofors design was Swedish, clean, efficient, crafted with the precision of a watchmaker and the brutality of a nation that understood war. When the United States secured a license to build it, American engineers scaled its production to an industrial level that Sweden could never have imagined. Soon factories in Detroit and Ohio were churning out barrels, mounts, gears, and feed trays by the thousands. What arrived in American training camps was a mechanical beauty. 120 to 140 rounds per minute, a blistering rate for a gun of its size. A 40mm HE shell weighing nearly 2 pounds. A recoil system that kicked like a living beast but returned to aim instantly. A loading rhythm so smooth it felt choreographed. But what stunned the soldiers most was the violence of its impact. The first time they saw a 40mm HE round detonate in midair, it wasn't just a flash. It was a blossom of orange fire surrounded by a cloud of razor-sharp steel fragments that tore through everything within meters. Even seasoned artillerymen stared open-mouthed. One corporal murmured, "Lord, that thing would ruin someone's day." Still, doctrine was doctrine. The Bofors was for the air, no exceptions. But then came the war. December 7th, Pearl Harbor. The world changed in a single morning, and with it the expectations placed upon every American weapon. Production tripled. Training accelerated. Anti-aircraft battalions were formed, armed with 90mm heavy guns and 40mm Bofors for close-range protection. The Bofors traveled everywhere, across the Pacific, across the Atlantic, to desert ports and jungle bases. And everywhere it went, soldiers whispered about its other potential. In Tunisia, the first rumors began. Some guys dropped a Stuka with it, but they also shredded a German truck. In Sicily, it chewed through a stone wall. In England, a Bofors round went right through a scrap tank turret at the range. The legend grew even before the battlefields proved it. What set the Bofors apart wasn't just its explosive power. It was the volume of fire. Unlike the slow, single-shot bark of the 37mm AT gun or the thunderous but lumbering 105mm howitzers, the 40mm could deliver a rainstorm of steel, 5, 10, 20 shells in seconds, all landing on a single point with decisive accuracy. American soldiers developed a kind of superstitious respect for it. They talked about the gun like it was a living creature, a temperamental beast that demanded good handling, quick hands, and nerves of iron. Crews boasted about how fast they could load, how smoothly they could track targets, how confidently they could fire long bursts without losing control. They joked that the Bofors didn't just kill aircraft, it killed anything it got angry at. But the truth, the shocking battlefield-proven truth, was still ahead of them. They didn't know that the 40mm would become one of the most feared multi-role weapons of the war. They didn't know that it would stop German armored cars dead, collapse bunkers, gut half-tracks, and even destroy tanks under the right conditions. They didn't know that in Tunisia, their commanders would shout the words that changed everything: "Lower the barrel." They didn't know that in Normandy, the Bofors would roar through hedgerows like a mechanical dragon. They didn't know that in the Ardennes, in the darkest, coldest days of the Battle of the Bulge, it would become the gun that kept entire infantry companies alive. What they knew, standing on the training grounds, wiping smoke from their eyes, was that the Bofors 40mm was not just a sky gun. It was a promise, a weapon waiting to reveal its true nature. A sleeping monster of steel and fire. And soon, in the dust of Tunisia, that monster would awake. In Tunisia, the Bofors 40mm lost its innocence. It arrived in North Africa as a polite weapon, disciplined, doctrinal, meant to swat aircraft from the desert sky. But war has a way of rewriting manuals faster than any general can print them. And in the jagged hills and burning sands of Tunisia, American gunners discovered that their sky gun was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The first time the barrel came down happened out of desperation. It was February 1943, just days after the disaster at Kasserine Pass. The Americans were retreating, battered and humiliated, while German trucks and half-tracks pushed forward with frightening speed. The sky was empty, no Stukas, no Bf-109s, yet the Bofors crews were ordered to stay alert in case enemy aircraft returned. So the 40mm guns sat at crossroads, on ridge lines, and behind battered infantry. On a long, dusty road near Spiba, one AA battery watched as a column of German supply trucks burst from behind a hill, racing to reinforce Rommel's attack. The American infantry had no anti-tank guns ready. Most had been knocked out or abandoned. A lieutenant sprinted to the Bofors crew, panting, dust caking his face. "Can you hit those trucks?" he shouted. The gun captain hesitated. The manual was clear. The 40mm was for aircraft. But the lieutenant wasn't asking for doctrine. He was asking to stay alive. "Get that damn barrel down!" he ordered. The gunners swung the barrel earthward, their motions awkward at first, as if they were violating some sacred law. The lead truck rattled closer, sunlight flashing off its windshield. "Fire!" The first 40mm round struck the engine block like a hammer from God. The HE shell exploded into a ball of fire. The second shell hit the truck behind it, flipping it sideways. A chain reaction rippled down the column as HE shells detonated with terrifying force, blowing tires 30 feet in the air, shredding radiators, rupturing fuel tanks. One gunner later said, "It didn't feel like shooting a truck. It felt like shooting a building." The infantry stared in disbelief. What they had witnessed was not flak. It was artillery, automatic, accurate, devastating. Word spread within hours. Across the front, Bofors crews began lowering their barrels at every opportunity. The practice wasn't officially approved, but nobody in Tunisia cared. When an Afrika Korps armored car tried to break through an American checkpoint near Beja, a 40mm crew fired a 4-round burst. The shells punched through its thin side armor, filling the cabin with flames. The vehicle rolled to a smoking halt. A nearby GI muttered, "Holy hell, we've been towing anti-tank guns without even knowing it." German soldiers soon learned to fear the distinctive boom of the Bofors. They had assumed the Americans relied on the 37mm AT gun, a weapon that often bounced off the armor of Panzer IIIs and IVs. But the 40mm was something else entirely. It wasn't technically an anti-tank gun, but the explosive power of its shells, combined with the rate of fire, made it lethal against anything lighter than a full-sized battle tank. In one engagement outside Gafsa, an American column came under attack from a German SDKF-232 heavy-armored car. The vehicle's 20mm autocannon opened fire, rounds sparking against American half-tracks. The infantry dove for cover. A lone Bofors crew, half dug in, rotated toward the threat. "Lower!" the gun captain barked. The barrel dipped until it pointed directly at the armored car. The gun opened fire. The first 40mm round struck the engine block like a hammer from God. The HE shell exploded into a ball of fire. The second shell hit the rear hull, igniting ammunition. The explosion lifted the vehicle off the ground. When the smoke cleared, the armored car was a twisted, burning sculpture. Stories like this spread through American ranks like campfire legends. The infantry started requesting Bofors support for clearing trenches, smashing machine gun nests, and destroying fortified farmhouses. In one battle near the Mareth line, the gun was used to collapse a stone building being used as a German sniper post. 3 rounds, 1 building gone. Even the British officers watching the Americans shook their heads. One remarked, "They're using it like a miniature naval gun." By late March 1943, something had changed fundamentally in the way American troops viewed the Bofors. It was no longer just their umbrella against the Luftwaffe. It had become a scalpel and a sledgehammer, whatever the moment required. And most surprising of all was its effect on German morale. Captured Afrika Korps soldiers spoke with frustration about being hit by that rapid gun, unaware it was originally meant to shoot at planes. They had seen trucks shredded, bunkers ripped apart, and reconnaissance vehicles turned into scrap metal. A German NCO confessed, "When the 40mm fired, we didn't know where to hide. It came too fast, too violent." Tunisia forged the Bofors' new identity. It went into Africa as an anti-aircraft gun. It came out as one of the most versatile weapons in the entire U.S. arsenal. The men of the desert had awakened the monster. And in Normandy, surrounded by hedgerows and ambushes, that monster would become something even more terrifying. Normandy was not the desert. It was a maze, a green, suffocating labyrinth carved by centuries of farmers and bordered by hedgerows thick enough to swallow entire squads. The men who landed on D-Day thought the worst was behind them after crossing the beaches. They were wrong. Inside the Bocage country, every field was a fortress, every crossroads a trap, every hedgerow a perfect ambush site for German infantry, machine gun teams, and armored vehicles lying in wait. And into this nightmare came the Bofors. No one had planned for it to fight here. The gun was mounted on trailers or half-tracks, tall and conspicuous, hardly the subtle predator one might choose for hedgerow warfare. But as in Tunisia, necessity overruled theory. German resistance was vicious. Standard infantry support weapons, rifles, machine guns, even mortars, often bounced harmlessly off thick Norman walls or were lost behind hedgerows that blocked line of sight. Bazookas were deadly, but only at suicidal distances. The Americans needed something that could clear a hedgerow, destroy a hidden bunker, and shred vehicles trying to escape. They needed violence on demand. They needed the 40mm. First blood in Normandy. The first major ground engagement for the Bofors in Normandy happened on June 9th, just 3 days after D-Day, near the town of Sainte-Mère-Église. An American column advancing along a narrow road was pinned down by German machine guns firing from a farmhouse built of thick Norman stone. Rifles and BARs did nothing. A Sherman tank tried to engage but couldn't depress its main gun low enough while stuck behind a hedgerow bank. Then an AA officer, almost as an afterthought, shouted, "Bring up the Bofors!" The gun rattled into position, its barrel swinging not toward the sky, but directly at the farmhouse door. The gun captain, without hesitation, ordered a short burst. 3 rounds flew, whoomp, whoomph, whoomph, and the front wall of the house simply ceased to exist. Debris rained down like hailstones. German soldiers bolted out the back, only to be met by infantry who'd been pinned for nearly an hour. The fight was over in seconds. A private from the 82nd Airborne, watching in stunned silence, whispered, "That wasn't a gun. That was a wrecking ball." The hedgerow monster awakens. Normandy taught the Americans very quickly that hedgerows were not obstacles, they were armor. A hedgerow could stop bullets, shrapnel, even a direct hit from some 75mm shells. But 40mm HE? That was different. When a Bofors round hit a hedgerow, it didn't just explode. It detonated inside the vegetation, blasting the foliage outward with lethal effect. Branches, dirt, stones, and splinters became deadly projectiles. Germans hiding behind hedgerows began to fear that familiar sound. The metallic buzz of the feed mechanism, the rising pitch of the power traverse motor, the sudden chest-thumping boom. In one engagement near Carentan, an American infantry platoon was ambushed from 2 hedgerows at once. The 40mm was called up. It aimed at one hedgerow, fired a 5-round burst, pivoted, and fired again. Trees snapped. Machine gun nests evaporated. German soldiers who survived the first strike abandoned their positions before the second burst arrived. A sergeant watching the destruction said later, "The hedgerows weren't protecting the Germans anymore. They were boxing them in." Killing armor, the manual said it shouldn't touch. Normandy wasn't just infantry ambushes, it was armor country. Half-tracks roamed the lanes, armored cars tried to slip through gaps, and German light tanks, like the Panzer II, French Hotchkiss captures, and even the occasional Panzer III, moved cautiously among the farms. This was where the Bofors shocked everyone. The 37mm AT gun struggled against German vehicles, bouncing off angled armor. But the 40mm HE rounds behaved differently. They didn't rely on penetration alone. They relied on overpressure, fragmentation, and structural shock. At Les Déserts, a German SDKF 250 half-track attempted to escape down a narrow lane. A Bofors crew tracked it like a plane diving for the deck. They fired 3 shots. The first ripped open the engine compartment. The second burst inside the troop area. The third flipped the vehicle on its side. When infantry reached the wreck, they were stunned. It looked like it had been hit by a naval gun, one soldier said. Another engagement saw a Bofors take on a Panzer II. The light tank attempted to maneuver behind a ridge, but exposed its side armor briefly. The 40mm hit it with a 10-round burst. The explosive shells cratered the turret, shattered vision blocks, and ignited interior equipment. The tank died in under 10 seconds. The manual had never listed tanks as valid targets. Normandy rewrote that rule by force. Killer house, killer barn, anything killer. Norman villages were fortresses made of granite, timber, and stubborn German machine gun nests. Typical infantry weapons couldn't crack them. Even Sherman HE rounds sometimes required multiple hits. But a Bofors could put 10 shells into that same window in 3 seconds. In Saint-Denis, an American unit used a 40mm to blast apart an entire barn being used by German snipers. One burst collapsed the roof. Another burst blew open the support beams. The final burst ignited hay and equipment. When the smoke cleared, the barn was gone. Not damaged, not cracked, gone. Men began calling the Bofors the hedgerow monster. Others simply called it the answer. Respect earned the hard way. Captured German soldiers were bewildered. They asked, "What gun was that? We heard flak, but it wasn't flak." For Germans trained to fear the 88mm and dismiss smaller calibers, the realization was humbling. The Americans had a 40mm gun that could fire faster than anything they fielded, with shells strong enough to kill from blast alone. One prisoner, shaking his head, told an American interpreter, "It was as if your anti-aircraft guns decided to fight us on the ground." He wasn't wrong. Normandy transformed the Bofors into a ground combat legend. Tunisia had awakened its potential. Normandy unleashed it. And in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, That unleashed monster would become a lifeline, firing not at plains or hedgerows, but into blizzards and darkness, holding back the Germans when everything else was failing. By December 1944, the Bofors was no longer just a weapon. It was a reputation. Infantrymen trusted it, tank crews requested it, engineers praised it, and German troops feared it. But no battlefield would test the 40mm more brutally or more unexpectedly than the frozen forests of the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge was chaos frozen into ice. The sky was a constant gray lid. Snow muffled footsteps and swallowed sound. Trees stood like skeletal walls, hiding shapes, echoes, and ambushes. Roads became white veins of death. The Luftwaffe reappeared in force. Armored spearheads punched through thin American lines, and infantry swarmed from the woods like shadows with rifles. In this nightmare, the Bofors became the firearm of last resort, because it was the only gun that seemed capable of doing everything at once. The skies closed. The ground is yours. The offensive began with a whisper, snowfall muffling the movement of German armor, and then erupted into an explosion of artillery and mechanized advance. For days, Allied air power was grounded. P-47s couldn't fly, Typhoons couldn't launch, recon planes stayed on runways buried in frost. Yet the Bofors crews remained at their posts. "At least we'll kill some aircraft," one gunner joked grimly. But no aircraft came. What came instead was something far worse. Columns of German infantry emerged between the pines. Panzergrenadiers advanced in white camouflage. Armored cars slipped across icy farm roads. And at night, German half-tracks prowled like wolves, headlights extinguished, trying to flank American units isolated in the blizzard. The 40mm crews realized something horrifying. They couldn't aim up anymore. The threat was below. So once again, the barrels came down. The frozen road ambush. Outside the village of Recht, a Bofors battery set up to guard a crossroads. Their gun pit was half filled with snow. The crew wore so many layers that they looked swollen, their gloves stiff with frost. Just before dawn, they heard it, the low rumble of engines in the cold air, unmistakable. A German convoy was approaching. Trucks, half-tracks, maybe tanks. The battery commander didn't hesitate. "Lower the barrel!" When the first German half-track appeared down the slope, the gun captain shouted, "On target!" The Bofors opened fire with a 5-round burst. The first round hit the glacis plate and ricocheted sparks into the snow. The next 4 exploded along the hull, ripping open the transport compartment and tearing through the infantry inside. A second half-track tried to reverse. The Bofors tracked it effortlessly. 3 more shells struck. The vehicle exploded in a fireball bright against the snow. American infantry later described the scene as the forest coughing fire. A gun that could stop a road by itself. In the Ardennes, controlling roads meant survival. Tanks couldn't maneuver through dense woods, and vehicles bogged down in drifts. Whoever held the roads controlled the battle. In many cases, a single Bofors did exactly that. At a narrow forest bend east of St. Vith, a lone 40mm gun was left behind as a rear guard while the main American force repositioned. Within the hour, a German convoy, 2 armored cars and a line of trucks advanced cautiously around the curve. The Bofors waited, then unleashed fury. The gunner fired 10 shells in rapid succession. Half the column was wrecked before they even realized what hit them. The surviving Germans abandoned their vehicles and fled into the trees. One American lieutenant later said, "That gun held a road the way a tank destroyer holds a ridge." Winter bunker breaker. The Germans dug defensive positions into frozen hillsides, carving bunkers into snow-covered slopes. Rifle fire from these positions was precise, deadly, and almost impossible to neutralize with small arms. But when a Bofors was brought forward, everything changed. In the village of Baraque des Fratures, an understrength American defensive group held a strategic junction. German infantry moved in waves, using houses and barns for cover. Machine guns rattled from upper floors. A 40mm gun was hauled into the square by 6 exhausted men, slipping on ice. The crew didn't bother with single shots. They fired bursts. Explosive rounds smashed into walls, collapsing them inward. Timber shattered. Entire rooms detonated from within. A German officer captured later confessed, "We thought a heavy artillery battery was firing. We had no idea it was only one small gun." Against armor in the snow. Even medium tanks felt the Bofors bite in the Ardennes. While the 40mm couldn't reliably penetrate Panther or Tiger armor, the HE rounds could disable tracks, destroy optics, detonate external equipment, wreck machine gun mounts, force tanks to button up, blind tanks by blasting through periscopes. In one fight near Malmedy, a Bofors hit a Panther turret ring repeatedly, jamming it. The tank crew, unable to rotate their gun, withdrew. It wasn't a kill, but it was a victory, achieved by a gun that shouldn't have been able to challenge tanks at all. The gun that sang through the blizzard. During the worst of the winter storms, something strange happened. Every rifle jammed, every machine gun froze, mortars misfired, even tank engines choked on ice. But the Bofors kept firing, slowly, painfully, but firing. In the nights when American soldiers could barely feel their hands, when the wind cut through uniforms like glass, they waited for the sound, the deep, rhythmic whump, whump, whump of a 40mm firing somewhere in the dark. To them, it meant, "We're still fighting. We're still here. You are not alone." One infantryman wrote in his journal, "That gun sang through the storm. When everything else froze, it didn't." Respect in the snow. German prisoners in the Ardennes echoed the shock of their comrades in Tunisia and Normandy. Many asked the same question, "What is that fast gun you use against our soldiers?" When told it was originally designed to shoot airplanes, they laughed in disbelief. Impossible. No anti-aircraft gun fires like that. But it did, and it turned the tide in countless small engagements. The Battle of the Bulge transformed the Bofors from a multi-role weapon into a battlefield legend. Tunisia revealed its potential. Normandy unleashed its fury. Ardennes showed its endurance, its ability to save lives when everything else faltered. But its story wasn't finished. Ahead lay the final chapter, the legacy of the gun that did everything, from shredding tanks to clearing skies, from breaking bunkers to holding roads. When the winter finally broke and the Ardennes quieted, the Bofors crews were left standing among blackened trees, burned-out vehicles, and snow stained with the memory of battles fought in darkness. Their hands were cracked from cold, their coats stiff with frozen grease, but their guns still sat there, steam drifting from its barrel, paint scorched, metal scarred. The war wasn't over, but those who had survived the Bulge understood something profound. The 40mm Bofors had become far more than an anti-aircraft gun. It had become the weapon of adaptability, a battlefield chameleon that met every threat the war could throw at it. And its story, its real legacy, was just beginning. A weapon that redefined its own purpose. When the Bofors first entered American service, no one imagined it would be used the way it ultimately was. Doctrine had tried to restrain it. Manuals had insisted on a single mission: kill aircraft. But war has a way of promoting the weapons that can survive in chaos. In Tunisia, the Bofors became an improvised anti-vehicle gun. In Normandy, it became a hedgerow-clearing monster. In the Ardennes, it became the line between life and death. By 1945, even commanders who once dismissed the gun's ground uses openly requested it for offensive operations. The image of the gun shifted, from a support piece to an assault weapon, from a background unit to the hammer at the front of an advance. This was the true miracle of the Bofors. It was never designed to do any of this, but it excelled at all of it. what the Germans saw. German troops, already conditioned to fear American artillery, now had a new nightmare. They had seen how American tank destroyers fought. They had experienced the ferocity of naval bombardments, but nothing unnerved them quite like the 40mm. Captured German officers repeatedly described it in interrogation reports. It hit like a bomb, but fired like a machine gun. That fast green tracer, it sliced through our positions. We thought it was your heavy artillery firing rapidly, but it was smaller, much smaller. To the German infantry, the Bofors was a paradox, too small to be heavy artillery, too deadly to be a light gun. It shattered their expectations, literally and psychologically. When German reconnaissance teams reported American positions, they began marking 40mm guns with the same caution reserved for tank destroyers and 105mm batteries. The Bofors, in their eyes, had become a strategic threat. The soldier's view, the gun that saved us. American infantry adored the Bofors, not because it was elegant or easy to use, but because it answered their most desperate needs. Need to break a bunker? Bring up the Bofors. Need to stop an armored column? Bring up the Bofors. Need to collapse a house filled with snipers? Bring up the Bofors. Need to tear an ambush out of a hedgerow? Bring up the Bofors. It became the Swiss Army knife of battlefield firepower. So reliable that infantry officers wrote after-action reports specifically recommending that Bofors units be attached to frontline companies, not just rear-area AA units. One GI wrote in a muddy-pocket notebook after surviving an ambush near Bastogne. Everything froze. Mortars, Brownings, bazookas. But the 40 just kept firing. I don't know how we got out of that field except for that gun. Another wrote to his wife, "It's strange to love a gun, but we all loved that one." The Navy's verdict, perfect. While the Army discovered the Bofors ground power, the Navy discovered its ideal anti-aircraft weapon. Destroyers, cruisers, and carriers mounted the 40mm in twin, quadruple, and even octuple configurations. Against kamikazes, it became the gold standard. Naval gunners said the same thing soldiers on land did. We never let it down. Ships that survived mass kamikaze attacks often credited their 40mm batteries for the victory. The gun simply did not quit. It fired in storms, in salt, in heat, in terror. After the war, the Bofors becomes a blueprint. When engineers studied every battlefield result, they wanted to understand why the Bofors succeeded in roles it was never designed to do. They found three answers: a perfect balance of shell size and rate of fire, small enough to be fast, big enough to destroy. Incredible mechanical reliability. The gun could fire thousands of rounds with minimal maintenance. And zero specialization. It wasn't limited to one battlefield domain. It could fight anywhere. These lessons shaped the next generation of weapons. Automatic cannons on Cold War vehicles, inspired by the Bofors. CIWS and naval flak systems, inspired by the Bofors. Modern infantry fighting vehicles with 25 to 40mm cannons, direct descendants of the Bofors lineage. Even today, some nations still field upgraded Bofors 40mm guns, nearly 80 years after their creation. A Swedish invention that became an American legend, and then became a world standard. Final moments on the battlefield. As 1945 approached and American forces crossed into Germany, many Bofors guns were repositioned towards the rear, not because they were obsolete, but because the Luftwaffe was dead and the German army shattered. The guns rested, their barrels worn smooth from thousands of rounds fired in deserts, hedgerows, forests, and towns. In one abandoned farmyard near Cologne, a Bofors crew paused to look at their gun. The war was almost over. Snow melted on the barrel, The breech was still warm. The gun captain patted the side of the mount and whispered, "You did everything we asked, and more." The others nodded. They had seen it shred trucks in Tunisia, erase bunkers in Normandy, and hold frozen roads in the Ardennes. They had seen what a 40mm shell could do to steel, to stone, to enemy morale. And they understood. This was the gun that never said no, the gun that never stayed in its lane, the gun that saved lives by refusing to be defined by its purpose. Legacy of the impossible gun. When historians looked back, they often praised the Sherman, the Garand, the Mustang, the 105 howitzer, but among the soldiers who fought on the front lines, those who bled in hedgerows and froze in Ardennes foxholes, there was always a special reverence for the 40mm Bofors. A reverence born from moments when everything seemed lost, and then a familiar rhythm began in the distance. Whump, 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 whump. The sound of a gun designed for the sky, saving men on the ground. The gun that did everything.